Welcome to the Ethical Humanist Society. Please be seated, and if you have cell phones or any other electronic devices, please make sure they're shut off. My name is Bobby Jacob, and I will be moderating today's program, New Strategies to Help Local Media Thrive. I'll start out today's program with a quote that helps define what humanism means to us as members of the Ethical Humanist Society. Humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. The life stance of humanism, guided by reason, inspired by compassion, and informed by experience, encourages us to live life well and fully. And that is from the Humanist Manifesto from the American Humanist Association. At the EHS, our programs address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts and sciences, to name just a few. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming relating to American culture. Today's speaker is Tim Franklin. He has been the top editor of 3 metropolitan newspapers, the Indianapolis Star, the Orlando Sentinel, and the Baltimore Sun. He now heads up the Medill Local News Initiative, a research and development project designed to bolster the sustainability of local news in America. He's also a member of Illinois' Local Journalism Task Force, created in 2022 to explore ways the state could help revive local journalism. Franklin will speak on the strategies being implemented to save local news access. Please welcome Tim Franklin.
Thank you, Bobby, for that kind introduction. I appreciate it, and it's great to be with you this morning. Thanks for coming out on this beautiful Sunday morning to sit inside and listen to me talk. But I really appreciate your interest in local news and coming out this morning for this conversation. And I'm going to try to walk through these slides quickly, but I have some slides that I thought would help illustrate what's happening with local news in America that I'd like you to see. And it's ironic and completely coincidental that we're meeting here this morning to talk about local news. Last night was the last daily printed newspaper printed in Chicago. The Chicago Tribune's Freedom Center is closing down, once one of the largest printing facilities in North America, and is going to be printed now in Schaumburg in the northwest suburbs. And I think that that's an embodiment of what's happening with local news around the country, and also with the changes that are happening in local media. You know, when I talk to other groups and to students, I talk about the fact that you and I are now living through seismic changes in how news is consumed, and how it's produced, and how it's distributed, and how it's paid for. These are really tectonic changes that are happening in the media industry, and we're still in kind of the early to mid innings of this change that's happening. How it's going to turn out, I don't think anybody knows, but what I do know, and which we're going to talk about a little bit this morning, is the fact that the implications for communities, the implications for our democracy, I think are potentially profound. And so this is a problem, this is an issue that has to be addressed and has to be worked out. And I've been working, as Bobby said, with the Illinois Local Journalism Task Force to try to address these issues here in the state of Illinois. So let's first kind of set the groundwork for this conversation and provide some context around it. Why does local news matter? And so sometimes people will say to me, hey, Franklin, so what if some newspapers close or some local news outlets close? It's part of our capitalist society. You know, we don't have as many Sears Roebucks stores anymore. We don't have J.C. Penney's. We don't have big box retailers. So what if a newspaper closes down? And I would argue that while it's tragic when any jobs are lost in society, that when a newspaper closes down, it's different. Newspapers, local news outlets are the glue, the fabric that binds a community together. And so that's why I think this matters. I'm going to talk about some of the implications for that here in a second. I first wanted to give you kind of a reason why local news matters. And this is a quote that I like from the Knight Foundation, the Knight Commission on Trust, Media, and Democracy. that was in a report just a couple of years ago. At its best, journalism informs the public on matters of civic concern, gives citizens a common set of facts, provides context that lends greater meaning to the news, independently monitors and holds those in power accountable, and strengthens public discourse. Good journalism helps us to understand others whose lives and challenges are different from our own. So what happens when local news goes away? There's now been some research on this, and there needs to be more, and we're doing a lot of that research at Northwestern. But there are a few things that we know from the research that's been done so far. Number one is that civic participation declines. So turnout in local elections goes down, the number of candidates seeking public office goes down. And it follows, right? I mean, if you're not aware of the issues in your community, you're not aware of the candidates running for public office, maybe you're not even aware there's a local election coming up, you're not going to vote, you're not going to run for public office, and to my way of thinking, that's not a good thing, that's not a healthy thing for communities. There's also research now that shows that in communities that are low information communities or that are news deserts, that government spending goes up and that government borrowing costs also rise. And why is that? It's because Wall Street knows that there are no watchdogs minding the store in these communities where there are no journalists providing that accountability. And one analogy that a former boss of mine used that I like to borrow is that journalists in a local community are kind of like traffic cops. Now, I'm not accusing any of you of committing crimes or of speeding, okay? But if you're driving down I-55 in Illinois and you know that there are no traffic cops, then you might drive a little bit faster than the speed limit. I've done that a time or two myself. But if you're driving down I-55 and you know that there are cops with radar guns, you're going to stick pretty close to the speed limit because none of us want to pay for that ticket. Journalists are like the traffic cops in local communities that are holding government officials accountable, that are writing about or broadcasting the actions of those folks. And when those journalists go away, that level of accountability is gone. And local community leaders in some cases think that they can get away with whatever they want. And the other aspect of this is that when there's no local journalism in a community, misinformation and disinformation flourishes. And so, and that tracks as well, because journalists are the ones in local communities that are checking documents and interviewing sources, and that are doing all of the things professionally journalists do to try to vet information and to report accurately and credibly in a local community. And one of the things I worry about, especially in this kind of hyper-partisan election year that we're now living through, is that we're going to see a wildfire of misinformation and disinformation before this fall's election. There are fewer local journalists who are writing about the issues, informing communities. That's not a good thing. We're seeing the rapid growth of AI and generative AI that makes it easy for people to produce misinformation, well, or robots, to produce misinformation or disinformation. And so, and we're also seeing this rapid rise of so-called pink slime, local, and I hate to use the word news, but local sites that are being produced by political action committees and by ideologues that are spreading misinformation and disinformation in communities. So I fear that we are headed toward a dumpster fire this fall with misinformation and disinformation. So one of the quotes that I pull out that I think also describes this problem, this is a quote that was in the New York Times just a couple of years ago when they wrote about the loss of local news, is after years without, and this is from a guy in Mount Dora, Florida, after years without a strong local voice, our community does not know itself, has no idea of important local issues or how the area is changing or challenged. We are a nameless, faceless town. And there are now, unfortunately, thousands of these towns that are nameless and faceless in the U.S. because of this crisis that's happening in local news. So Let me just quantify this a little bit. The Medill State of Local News Project is one of about 6 different local news-related projects that we have going at the Medill School at Northwestern. We now have the largest database of local news organizations anywhere in the country. And why do we do that? We do that so that we can see trends that are happening in local news, so we can identify areas that are news deserts, so that we can identify areas that are on the brink of becoming news deserts, so that local communities can act before it's too late, so that investors can act, so that the community can try to do something before it becomes a news desert. How do we define a news desert? It's a community, either rural or urban, where residents have very limited access to credible and comprehensive news and information that feeds democracy at the grassroots level and nurtures community. So I'm going to spend a minute on this map. This is from our State of Local News report that we just published at the end of last year. The yellow counties in the U.S. are counties with no local news. They have no newspaper, they have no digital site, they have no ethnic media, they have no public radio. There are now 203 entire counties in the U.S. with no local news, none. There are now 1,558 counties, and these are the counties in dark purple, with only one local news outlet remaining, either a newspaper, a digital site, a public radio station, or an ethnic media outlet. And then the other kind of gray counties that you see are ones with 2 or more local news outlets. So when you add up the counties with either no local news or with only one local news source, you're talking about more than half of the counties in the United States with very limited access to local news and information. And to me, I think that's very concerning. You can almost draw a straight line from the Texas-Mexico border all the way up through the spine of the country, up through the Dakotas, and they're either news deserts or they're near news desert counties. And if you look in the southeast and in the west, you also see that there are many news deserts or one news outlet counties. So there are really big chunks of the country that are not getting local news and information that need it. And to me, that's very frightening. About 96% of all the counties that are news deserts are in rural America. Now, there are news deserts in the suburbs, and there are news deserts in other parts of the country, but these are primarily in rural areas. But the loss of local news isn't just happening in rural America, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that here in a second. So I'm going to lay some numbers on you just to illustrate this problem, and then we're going to get to what's being done about it. So we've lost about 1/3 of all newspapers in the U.S. since 2005, 1/3. We've lost 70% of newspaper staffers since 2005, 70%. As I mentioned, there are 96% of the news desert counties are in rural areas. And there's also this other issue that we're now in the process of researching, and it's this whole issue of ghost news. We call them ghost newspapers. These are newspapers that exist in name only. So they're being printed and they're being distributed or they're being posted online, but they have no local staff. They're being edited from someplace else. The news is from someplace else. There's no original local reporting that's happening in those communities. So we're now doing research at Northwestern on this ghost newspaper problem, and we're going to be publishing this report later this year. It's safe to say that there are many hundreds of ghost newspapers in the U.S. So as bad as the news desert problem is, the problem is actually worse when you look at coverage, when you look at loss of coverage of local news. And we also wanted to look at the demographics of the areas that are news deserts. And these are folks that maybe need local news the most. They live in counties where there's lower than average household income, there's lower than average educational attainment levels, they're older, and they also have more folks living above the poverty line. Now, one of the things we did with last year's report is we ask our data scientists at Medill, and we're blessed to have, I think, some of the best in the country, as well as the journalism faculty. We looked at all the demographic characteristics of current news desert counties, and then we said, let's take a look at the counties with only one news source and see if they have these same characteristics that could lead them to become news deserts in the near future, say the next 5 years. So we ran the data, we ran the numbers, we ran the demographic figures, and we've now put 228 additional counties on the Medill watch list. And the watch list counties are the ones in blue on this map. There are 228 counties on the Medill watch list. So there are 203 current news deserts. We have an additional 228 counties that we've put on this watch list. The watch list counties, if they all become news deserts, would more than double this problem of news deserts in the next 5 years. Now, there has been growth in digital-only local news sites, and that's a good thing. The addition of these digital sites is not keeping up with the loss of newspapers. And these digital sites, at least at the moment, are primarily smaller. They're a lot smaller in most cases than the newspapers that have been lost, but we are seeing some growth. But one of the issues that we see is that most of these digital-only sites that are being created are in metro areas, not in the areas where we're seeing news deserts. So you see along the Acela corridor on the East Coast, there are many digital-only sites in metro areas there. In California, in the Silicon Valley, and up the Pacific Coast, there are digital sites being created in and around Chicago, in Florida, and parts of Texas, but there are vast swaths of the country that are not seeing this growth in digital-only local news sites. And then ethnic media, which I think is a really important role to play in local news. They're having many of the same challenges as legacy newspapers. I'm going to get to why that's happening. But these ethnic media sites are also concentrated by and large on the two coasts and in Chicago and in Florida and parts of Texas. And then public radio stations, which I think also are an important component of the local news ecosystems. There are about 1,100 public radio stations around the U.S., but only about 20% of them are doing original local reporting. Many of these public radio stations are what we call repeater stations. They're picking up signals from other areas and replaying the content from those stations. It's often jazz or music, but I think public radio could play an important role in solving this local news crisis that we're in, but right now, very few of them have original local reporting. And then I wanted to put up the Illinois stats because Illinois is one of the hardest hit states in the nation with loss of local news. 85% of newspaper journalists in the state of Illinois have been lost since 2005. I'm going to repeat that. Illinois has lost 85% of its newspaper journalists since 2005, the highest rate in the nation. The state's lost 36%, or 232 newspapers, since 2005, and that's among the 10 highest rates of loss in the nation. About half of the newspapers that have been lost here in the Chicagoland area, many of them in suburban Cook and in the suburbs around Chicago. We've also seen some loss within the city of Chicago. Cook County is not in danger of becoming a news desert. There's still many, we count about 107 local news organizations in Chicago, broadcast, digital, niche, newspapers, et cetera. But there have also been many losses of local newspapers in the suburbs. Illinois has 4 news desert counties, all of them down in southern Illinois. We have 4 additional Illinois counties that are on our watch list, and there are 33 counties in the state with only 1 news source remaining. But Illinois has been especially hard hit. So what does this all add up to? Nancy Lane, who's the CEO of the Local Media Association, I'm privileged to work with her. I'm on the board of the Local Media Association. Said frankly to the Illinois Local Journalism Task Force a few months ago, we're in a dire situation. And Steve Waldman, who's the president of Rebuild Local News, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and the founder of our Report for America, said the entire local news ecosystem is collapsing. So how did we get here? So now we know that we're in this crisis. We know what the problem is, what the numbers are. How did we get here? So as you know, the digital revolution shifted readers away from print to smartphones and PCs. And that's happened in droves. With the advent of AI and the growth of generative AI, especially this year, that trend is only going to continue. And I just co-authored with a couple of colleagues a report that we published a couple weeks ago on the impact of AI on local news. And it's going to be profound. It could be positive. It could help local news organizations run more efficiently. It also could be an existential threat. I'm sure all of you do Google searches, correct? Right now, when you do a Google search, it will bring up summaries and links that will take you to news stories so that you can go find whatever information it is that you're looking for. And the local news organization gets a tiny bit of programmatic ad revenue from that search, and they also get credit for the traffic that's coming to their site. With generative AI, you ask a question in your search, and it just gives you an answer. It doesn't take you to a local news site. It just gives you an answer. Now, it may not be the correct answer. It may not be the accurate answer, but it's an answer. But so all of that traffic that right now is going from your search to a local news organization, a lot of that could go away. And just this past week, Google announced that it's fully rolling out its generative AI platform called Gemini. And Gemini does just that. You do a query, it answers your query. It doesn't refer you to a local news site, or if it does, those links are much further down in your search. This could have a catastrophic effect on traffic to local news organizations and on ad revenue that goes to those local news organizations. We're going to have to see how this rolls out. As some of you may have read, the New York Times has filed a lawsuit against OpenAI and Microsoft, alleging copyright infringement, that basically these platforms are taking the content that they're producing and posting it, and that they're not getting any compensation back for the work that they're doing in producing that content. Alden Global Capital, just a week or two ago, also filed a lawsuit against OpenAI and Microsoft. So this is going to be a huge, huge legal battle that we're all going to be reading about over the next couple of 3 years. It's going to be the mother of all copyright legal fights. And we're all going to be watching it, and the stakes are absolutely huge. And right now, 3 companies soak up about 75% of all the new digital ad revenue. And that's Google, Meta, and Amazon. So that basically doesn't leave much for local news organizations that need that revenue to support local journalism. It was just about 10 or 12 years ago, as Bobby mentioned, I edited 3 metro newspapers, and we saw these trends in meetings that I was in. But it was only 10 or 15 years ago that about 80% of a newspaper's revenue came from advertising. A lot of it from local advertisers trying to reach an audience in a given community. A major chunk of that came from classified ads. So you wanted to buy a used car, you wanted to look at job listings, you wanted to look at real estate listings in your community. You went to the local newspaper or to that local newspaper's website to get that information. So with Craigslist and Cars.com and Zillow and Redfin and all these digital sites that have been created that we all use and appreciate the convenience of, but that revenue that they're reaping is revenue that used to go to local news organizations. And then home delivery circulation was a real profit center for a lot of newspapers. These were steady, reliable readers who were paying a monthly fee for the newspaper to be dropped off in their porch or in their driveway. And the other thing we've seen over the past number of years is the consolidation of local news with big companies. So half of all daily newspapers in the U.S. are owned by just 10 companies. The biggest of which is Gannett Gatehouse, which came together just about two and a half years ago. And they own 487 newspapers around the country. Alden Global Capital, the hedge fund or private equity firm that owns the Chicago Tribune and Tribune Company, owns 190 newspapers now, and then you go down the list. Many of the newspapers outside Chicago and downstate Illinois are owned by either Gannett or by Lee Enterprises, which also has its support from private equity. Okay, so now I've done my Dr. Doom shtick, and I've depressed you all, and you're all wondering, why am I spending a sunny Sunday morning listening to this guy talk about all this doom and gloom stuff? So there are some signs of hope in local news, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, and why I'm hoping that we can find a pathway forward. So this is a map that we created in our report from the end of 2023 called Local News Bright Spots. So all of the white illuminated dots that you see on this map are local news organizations that have started up in just the last 5 years. And as you can see, there are a bunch of them. There are about 150 or so, many of them, again, concentrated on the east and west coasts. But as you can see, there also are a number of them in Illinois. So that's a good thing. The blue stars that you see there are 17 local news organizations that we identified as ones that have kind of figured this out. They've built sustainable business models, and they're fairly stable, or as stable as anybody can be in this environment. So these are the beacons of hope for local news around the country. So what are the reasons for optimism? There are some legacy news organizations that are innovating, and they're pivoting from print to digital and to a reader revenue business model. So I showed you that 10, 15 years ago, about 80% of all the revenue for local news came from advertising. Now more than half of revenue for local news organizations comes from readers through digital subscriptions or memberships. So that now has become a really significant part of the menu. The New York Times, and I'm sure we have many New York Times subscribers here, they have really succeeded at this reader revenue business model, and that's only continuing to grow for them. As I mentioned, we've seen modest growth in nonprofit and digital-only sites around the country. We've also seen philanthropy really step up to try to help local news. Back in September, the MacArthur Foundation, based here in Chicago, along with the Knight Foundation, based in Miami, announced a campaign called Press Forward. This campaign is going to pump more than $500 million into local news. There are now about 57 or so foundations around the country that have joined this consortium with MacArthur and Knight that are putting money into this pool of funds that will provide grants to help local news organizations, or to try to help those of us who are helping and working with local news organizations. Now, $500 million, where I come from, is a lot of money, but that is still not close to what's needed to get back to where we were with local news. It's also $500 million over 5 years, so it's $100 billion a year spread over 50 states. So again, I applaud them for what they're doing. This is highly significant, highly symbolic, and hopefully this will provide some runway for local news organizations to figure out a new business model. And then there's a growing movement to provide public policy solutions to help local news. As Bobby mentioned, the governor appointed me to the Illinois Local Journalism Task Force. I don't know the exact number. I think there were about 18 or so of us from around the state that worked on this task force for more than a year. Illinois is now one of 14 states around the country that have either approved legislation or are considering legislation to help strengthen local news around the country. And there's also a bill pending in Congress, the Bipartisan Community News and Small Business Support Act, that is pending in Congress. The odds of that getting out of this Congress, the odds of much of anything getting out of this Congress are not really high. But nonetheless, there is this kind of growing sense that public policy needs to do something, needs to get involved. So what would the legislation in Illinois do? And by the way, as some of you may know, we're in the, I wouldn't say we're in the 11th hour of the legislative session. Maybe we're in the 10th hour of the legislative session in Springfield. There's a couple weeks left before the scheduled adjournment. And there are several pieces of legislation that are pending in Illinois to try to help local news. What are they? Well, one would require tech platforms like Google and Meta to pay a journalism usage fee to eligible Illinois news providers beginning next year. There's also similar legislation pending in California that would also require, it's primarily Google and Meta or Google and Facebook, to reimburse local news organizations for use of their content on their platforms. This type of legislation has already been passed in Australia. It's also been passed in Canada. In Canada, it's resulted in about $100 million Canadian dollars going back to local news organizations. Google negotiated a settlement with the Canadian government and with local news organizations to provide that support. Now, as you can imagine, this legislation is being lobbied to death in Springfield. We'll see if it's lobbied to death. It's being lobbied. But this is pending in Illinois. And the idea is that Google and Meta are profiting off the content that local news is helping to populate on their platforms, and that they need to give some of that back to help local news outlets. There's also legislation pending that would require state government agencies to set aside at least 50% of their ad spending on local news organizations. Right now, a lot of that advertising spending is going to the tech platforms. That type of program is happening in New York City right now, and that's resulted in tens of millions of dollars in New York City advertising going back to local community news outlets there. And then there's also the idea of tax credits. And there's legislation pending that would provide tax credits to local news outlets that hire and retain journalists, and also legislation that would subsidize small businesses that advertise in local news organizations up to a certain cap. New York State just passed a couple of weeks ago legislation that would provide the tax credits for hiring and retaining local journalists. And the Illinois legislation, I think, is somewhat similar to what just passed out of the state of New York. And there's also legislation pending that would create a journalism student scholarship program for students who commit to work at Illinois local news organizations for at least 2 years upon graduation. And so the idea is that we need to fill the pipeline for the next generation of local journalists. We'll see what passes. But the next 2 weeks, I think, are going to be very critical for this legislation. And then just to give you an idea, I wanted to briefly tell you what's happening at Medill at Northwestern. We created the Medill Local News Initiative back in April of 2018, so we just turned 6 years old. And this is a research and development project that we hope is helping local news organizations, and that we hope is helping the public's understanding of what's happening in local news in the U.S. We're doing research projects aimed at providing new insights about the state of local news and the behaviors of local news audiences. We're going to be dropping either next week or the week after what we think is the largest poll that's ever been done in the Chicago region of how you and I and others are consuming local news these days. And there's some absolutely massive shifts that are happening in all of our news consumption habits. And I think that these survey results are going to help local news outlets better understand what's happening. And then we're also turning our research into action. So last year, we set up the Medill Local News Accelerator. This is a program based on our downtown Chicago campus. So we're doing research for local news organizations in Chicago, and then we take that research and we help local news outlets with things like business strategy and product development and audience engagement tactics that help them grow their audience. This year's cohort includes WBEZ and the Chicago Sun-Times, WTTW, The Reader, Shaw Publications, which owns some papers in suburban Chicago, and Borderless Magazine, which is covering issues related to immigration in Chicago, as well as Cicero Independiente is also one of our partners this year. Let's see, going on from there. These are the various projects in our local news initiative. I'd also invite you to look at our local news initiative website, which has fresh articles on trends that are happening in local news and also some of the local news research that we produce. We also started a Media Innovation and Leadership Academy last year, so we bring a cohort of media leaders and young kind of stars of news organizations to come in, and they spend a week at Northwestern in an immersive leadership and innovation academy. We now have more than 25 faculty, staff, and students that are working on this local news initiative project at Medill, and these are their faces, or the faces of many of them at Northwestern. So that's it. There's a QR code if any of you are interested in going to the Medill Local News Initiative website to learn more about our work there. But with that, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your interest in this topic and for being here this morning. And I guess I'll try to answer some questions here in a minute. Okay, thank you very much.
The Q&A portion will follow after this brief musical interlude, and viewers should be thinking about their questions and entering them in the chat box. During the interlude, we will be collecting contributions. Contributions can be made at our website. That's ethicalhumanistsociety.org/donate. A link will be posted in the YouTube chat, and our in-person audience can scan posted QR codes or use the basket if it is passed around. It is through our generosity that we show how meaningful the Sunday morning programs are. The suggested donation is $5. However, any amount that one is comfortable with is greatly appreciated. We appreciate all those who help sustain the society with their donations of time and money. anyone in the audience have a question, they can step up to the mic. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Definitely an important subject. I have a lot of sympathy for the position that you're, I think, advocating, but I want to push you a little bit on your assessment, and maybe Medill actually has the answer, and maybe you do, and you can elaborate. And so I sort of see this as a quantity and a quality in the first part of your talk with the assessment. And you really talked about quantity, like how many newspapers, how many journalists are there. And it struck me that your assessment is off by magnitude of, if not 2, 10 might be more likely. For example, I am a reader of more than one newspaper, and for many years read the Tribune, which has totally slashed their readership. But many of the journalists who work for the Tribune have a blog on Substack. I subscribe to them. I don't think you included that as and that is definitely local news. It's how I have come to get local news. That's one example. Another is I live in Old Irving Park in Chicago. We have a newsletter. It is quite informative of the zoning issues, the aldermen, what are the issues, the streets, all local news. Also, I suspect not included in the account. So I'm pushing a little bit on the assessment because it strikes me that the big message here is journalism as a profession, which I do have a lot of personal sympathy for, is under threat. And even the people with a Substack, and from personally hearing and reading what they're saying, they're actually doing fine. They're actually able to make a living publishing online. So I'm pushing a little bit on the quantity, that you've presented quantity and isn't as dire as that there's a lot of substitutes. And even, I'm not a social media user, but Facebook and other are how people may be getting local news. I don't know how it works well enough to know if that's true. So the issue might really be quality, which you really didn't address. I know that becomes hard to define, but so I'm pushing a little bit. Are things as dire? Because I feel like there's never been as much information as there is now. Yeah, 2 months.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question, and it's a good question. Yes, so there's an issue with quality and with quantity. And I mentioned ghost newspapers that have no staff or not doing original local reporting. That's a quality problem. And yes, there are new platforms where journalists are writing, where non-journalists are writing about local matters, including Substack. One of the things that there's been anecdotal research on is what happens in a news desert when local news organizations go away, and primarily it's Facebook groups. People will form Facebook groups in a community, and I love that. I think it's great when people create Facebook groups to share news and information. The problem with the Facebook groups is that they're not journalists moderating those conversations, that are doing vetting of information that's on those, and they become outlets or vessels to spread misinformation and disinformation in many cases. There are journalists who are working on Substack, who are doing podcasts, who are doing other platforms. Many of them are single topic Substacks. Are any of you on Substack? Some of you are now. I mean, there are some journalists that are doing very well on Substack. They're writing columns, they're writing about local education, but they're not, for the most part, writers who are covering local town councils, local school boards, local zoning boards, that are providing that kind of accountability reporting that local communities need. So yes, are they out there? Absolutely. Are some doing terrific work? For sure. But they're not local news organizations that are covering a wide swath of a community, the business community, the schools, economic development, sports. So you can get local information from these other platforms. Is it as comprehensive as what you used to get? I would argue no.
Thanks so much for
Sure.
your presentation.
Yeah, thank you.
I wanted to get your thoughts on misinformation and disinformation and how other parts of the world, maybe like in Europe, the EU, deal with that. I think in the US, free speech is kind of the bedrock of who we are, but I don't think the founding fathers ever imagined that, you could, with the click of a button on the internet, that Alex Jones could broadcast to millions of people that, Sandy Hook was a hoax,
Right.
or, stuff like
Right.
that. So how do other parts of the world handle new technologies that, like Facebook has made and Twitter always say, we're not really publishers.
Right.
We can't be held accountable
Right.
for this the way a newspaper publisher would. But my understanding is that in Europe, they have much stronger rules on holding big tech accountable.
Yeah.
On social media.
Yeah. That's a great question, and thank you for the question. So there's a lot to unpack there. Local news and misinformation, disinformation is handled very differently in different parts of the country. Already in Europe, in parts of Europe and in other parts of the country, there are government subsidies that are helping to subsidize local news, so that's helping on the financial side. In terms of misinformation and disinformation, there are a lot of problems here in the U.S. One is that I think we have a gigantic news literacy problem in the U.S. And we have a news literacy expert on the faculty at Medill. But if you think about it, you're all just hit with this information on Facebook or in other social media platforms, Instagram or TikTok or whatever, and you don't know what's real and what isn't. And that problem is only going to be exacerbated with AI. So it's all just going to be this stuff. It's garbage in, garbage out. We're going to be flooded, and especially in this election year, with stuff. They're now basically misinformation farms in parts of like Macedonia and in other parts of the country, and their whole operation is to feed misinformation and then to try to profit off the programmatic ad revenue that comes with clicks that gets on that information. So there are regulations in place in parts of Europe, in Australia, as I mentioned, and other parts of the world that have tighter privacy regulations and that also do more monitoring of social media platforms. I'm a First Amendment purist. I believe in the First Amendment. I believe in the right to free speech. And so to an extent, part of this issue is living in a society that has a First Amendment and believes in it. I also completely understand that for news organizations who spread misinformation and disinformation, there are libel laws that we are all subject to that prevent us from or disincentivize us from spreading lies about people or misinformation or disinformation. But if you're an anonymous person on social media, those libel laws and that doesn't apply. So that's how it becomes sort of the Wild West. These disembodied, faceless people or bots are spreading misinformation and disinformation almost separate and apart from libel law or the U.S. court system. I think that, as you know, there's a growing movement around the country, including in Congress, to regulate social media platforms. Mark Zuckerberg was recently testifying on Capitol Hill. There's been a huge problem, and there's a whole best-selling book about it now, about the mental health issues, challenges that result from kids spending a lot of time on social media. And Zuckerberg issued a bit of an apology to the parents who were at that hearing, which got a lot of public attention. But there is, I think, a growing bipartisan movement in Congress to slap additional regulation on these social media platforms. And I would not be surprised if that happens in the next year or two.
My question is sort of build on the concern that was raised earlier about quality. I've been active in the community here in recent years, and Skokie is kind of a news desert, not so much that there aren't local news outlets, but the quality of the local news coverage is at times astonishingly abysmal. One example is we recently had a reporter contact us who was one of these Tribune contract reporters who happened to be a student from Wisconsin who was studying music at Yale covering Skokie. And he had no idea what he was doing, no idea of what the issue was. So we were very gracious and supportive of him and sort of tried to coach him along. And then, of course, he's gone, and now there's somebody else. And we also talked to, is it Mark Miller from the Round Table and also Joe Coughlin from the Record about how we can get some resources so we can have a local reporter that is familiar with Skokie and knows the people and knows the issues. And we talked a little bit about the economics of that. Those are a nonprofit model, but maybe a sort of an associated model. Like, so you have Chicago used to have a city desk, and you had the Associated Press, United Press International, where you had a sort of consolidation of resources for the purposes of covering things. Is there any exploration of alternate models besides the ad revenue, or of consolidating some of the capabilities, if you will, of the news gathering, so that you can get that kind of quality, but then have different outlets, that could tap into that?
Yeah, it gets back to money, and it gets back to financial support to support local journalism. And so about half of the news outlets that have been lost in Illinois have been lost in the suburbs outside Chicago. So Skokie, there was a newspaper that shut down on the North Shore a couple of years ago. We are seeing a loss, especially in these suburban areas, of local news outlets. And then the question is, what is the new model that's going to come in behind it? And so do any of you see The Record? Do any of you subscribe to The Record on the North Shore? A couple of you do. So that was a digital startup that emerged from the loss of the local paper. I know the folks who are running it. I've met with them a couple of times. They're working very, very hard with very limited resources to try to cover Skokie and this area. I think that there are some entrepreneurs that are building new models that are succeeding. There's one in suburban Kansas City that's run by a husband and wife team that's doing very well. There are others around the country. But it's going to take that kind of innovation to build an economic base to support the kind of reporting that you're talking about. It's also going to take philanthropy and public policy to provide the revenue to support journalists who can do that type of coverage. Journalism, and especially good journalism, costs money, and it requires news outlets to pay journalists to do that shoe leather reporting in communities that you all need to make informed decisions as citizens. And so I hope that there's increased public awareness about this problem. I hope that these efforts like Press Forward that MacArthur has initiated here in Chicago will get money into the hands of these local news outlets to help them figure out a sustainable strategy going forward. But without that, I fear that it's going to be a rough few years. And I'm also concerned about the implications for communities.
I happened to be talking to my brother in Minnesota a week or so ago, and his daughter happened to be there back from college. And she was soon going to be leaving for a summer internship at a small Minnesota newspaper. I was surprised that even existed. So I guess you've touched on a lot of these questions. If she wanted to pursue a career in that direction, how possible is that, and how would she go about that? It's baffling to me at this point. What would that mean?
Yeah, well, God love her for doing that, first of all. You know, I am an optimistic person, and I do think that we're going to come up with new models to support local news, whether it's through reader revenue or public policy or philanthropy to support it. There are programs like Report for America, which is being supported by philanthropy around the country that's putting local reporters like her into local newsrooms to provide that kind of coverage. California has a fellowship program that it's set up. It's run by Cal Berkeley that is putting recent college grads into local communities in California that don't have local news outlets. And there also are jobs that didn't exist 5 years ago or 10 years ago that are now being created. Social media strategists. We have grads that are getting jobs doing social media for local news outlets. Those are jobs that didn't exist before, but there are ways to get to especially younger readers that aren't getting information through print or through digital-only sites. You know, I think the skills that you develop in a journalism school, research, writing, editing, accuracy, those are skills that serve you well in a lot of different professions. My wife, as an undergrad, got a journalism degree, went to work for a wire service and a newspaper, and then decided to go to law school. And her journalism education served her well in the legal profession. So I wouldn't discourage people as a senior associate dean at a journalism school. I wouldn't discourage people from going to journalism school. There are new types of jobs that are being created. We have a whole podcasting specialization now that we didn't have before, and there are many local news podcasts that are being created around the country. So there are going to be opportunities, and I don't think we have a demand problem for local news, or at least to a great degree. We have a supply problem. You know, nobody wanted a pandemic to happen, but it did. And what we saw was in 2020 and 2021, both readership and subscriptions of local news outlets soared. Like we saw 50% plus increases in those 2 years. And why was that? It was because people needed reliable, accurate local news and information about what's happening with infection rates in my community, what's happening with the schools, are they open or closed, are we going hybrid, what's happening with local restaurants, are they being able to stay open or closed, what about the local hospitals or the local healthcare institutions. We really saw during the pandemic how critical that local news and information is. And so my hope is that, you know, many of the folks who subscribed or got engaged with local news during the pandemic will continue to do so now that, thank God, we're out of it. But that, I think, is a case study of why this is so important, and why I hope more young people like her decide to pursue careers in local news.
So I wanted you to talk a little more about ghost newspapers. I live in McHenry County, and before election time, we get a ghost newspaper that appears, the McHenry Times, and it's fairly, I mean, it's like 35% accurate and extremely slanted, and I'm wondering how, and somebody did a lot of work on these ghost newspapers, and I'm wondering more about how they're funded and what a normal person can do to combat this propaganda.
Yes. So there are a couple of issues that I think you bring up. Ghost newspapers, many of them are owned by the large chains that I had in my slide a few minutes ago. Some of them controlled by private equity, and they're basically harvesting the assets of these local publications for as long as they can. I don't know what the end goal is. Maybe it's to just profit for as long as they can and shut them down, profit for as long as they can and then sell them, or perhaps even to go into bankruptcy. But there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these ghost publications. You get them in your inbox, you get them delivered at home, and there's just virtually no original reporting that's happening in those. And that's going to continue to be a problem. And then there's also the whole pink slime problem. I'm not familiar with the McHenry publication, but some of you may have seen these in the last gubernatorial election, and they're going to pop up in this election in the fall. So political action committees on both the left and the right, but mostly on the right, have created newspapers, which I'm putting in air quotes, and they're basically propaganda vessels that are delivered to your mailboxes, they're delivered to your inboxes digitally, and they are just propaganda machines. And if you're an average person and you're busy and working and raising a family, you can't tell what these publications are. They look like legit papers, but when you get into them, the slant of some of these is really a problem. And there's an organization called NewsGuard, which checks to the extent it can, every publication in America. Is it legit or not? Does it have a corrections policy? Does it have an ethics policy? And they estimate there are now more than 1,200 of these pink slime publications around the country, and a bunch of them are in Illinois. And in fact, the propagator of one of the biggest of these companies is based here in Illinois. And you're going to be getting these in the fall, whether you like it or not, in your mailboxes or delivered to your computers. And it's a problem. And actually, companies are now getting engaged in the creation of these pink slime sites. Chevron in the Permian Basin in Texas has created a newspaper to talk about how great fracking is and how it's contributing to the economy of West Texas. One of the oil companies recently bought a local newspaper in California where it also has a large facility. So their companies are getting in on the act to spread information as well. So that's why I say I think we need, and by the way, Illinois was the first state in the nation to mandate media literacy in public schools, and I give the legislature a lot of credit for that. What I don't give the legislature credit for is that they haven't funded that mandate yet. So the law's on the books, but it's not really being executed. But I think in a healthy democracy, we all need to understand the role of the media, its relationship to our government, how it holds government accountable, and also just to give people the tools that they need so they can distinguish what's a legitimate source from a non-legitimate source. So my hope is that other states will follow Illinois in passing this mandate and then funding it as well.
I'm going to ask a question from the online chat. Can you talk about responsible citizen journalism and how that can be used to encourage and promote local news?
Yes. So we have seen more average citizens getting involved in the production of local news around the country. I think that's a great thing, and I hopefully we're going to see more of it. There was a whole kind of citizen journalism movement from just a few years ago, trying to engage citizens to become more engaged in the news. City Bureau in Chicago has a program called Documenters, in which they provide some basic training for citizens who then go out and cover government meetings. And they then, those citizens then write what happened at those meetings and make it publicly available. And we're now seeing the growth of some of these documenter programs around the country. And I applaud City Bureau for doing that. And I hope that there are more city bureaus, or that City Bureau grows those programs around the country, because it's yet another way to try to provide some accurate information to communities.
So when I canceled my local newspaper and they asked me, why? And I said, it took me 2 minutes to read it from the beginning to end. There was nothing in it. So I hope, and I missed that local newspaper. It seemed like there was, in the past, more worthwhile things to read about the local newspaper. So I hope, will that be done?
Well, you bring up a really important point. You know, I don't blame you for canceling if there's no local news in the publication. And one of the things that really worries me is there have been so many journalists lost and there have been so many cuts at news organizations that there's nothing left to read or there's no value proposition for people to subscribe. And this is as old as capitalism itself, right? You need to produce a product that people are willing to pay for, that people are willing to turn over their Visa card every month to get what it is, the product that you're offering up. And if there's no local news, if there are no local journalists producing original journalism, pretty soon you're going to cut it off because you're not getting value back for what it is that you're paying for. And so I worry that, especially as we see all the changes in technology and we see the secular downturn that's happening with the media in this country. And by the way, we didn't discuss it, but you know, this has been a very rough downturn in advertising for all local news in the past few months. We've seen job buyouts at the Washington Post. We've seen job losses at the Wall Street Journal, at a whole bunch of major, at CNN, at a whole bunch of major national news organizations. That's happening because there's less advertising revenue going to these places. But the problem, especially for local news outlets, is you get in this self-perpetuating decline where your revenue goes down, so you cut some jobs, you cut journalism jobs. Then that results in less coverage of the community. Then that in turn results in people like yourself canceling subscriptions because there's nothing left to read, and you kind of end up in this death spiral going down. And unfortunately, I think there are a number of local outlets that are in that spiral, and we got to figure out a way to reverse it.
You mentioned, I think it was 17 news organizations, local news organizations at teams who have kind of figured it out. And one of them looked to be in the Chicago area. I don't know if you can talk about that organization and what they're doing.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that question. By the way, and I should have mentioned that Chicago has become kind of this incubator of innovation around the country. As I mentioned, there are about 107 different local outlets in the Chicago area. And one of them, which we highlighted, is Block Club Chicago. Does anybody here read Block Club Chicago? Are you familiar with it? Okay, several hands go up. That's great. So Block Club Chicago was founded about 5.5 years ago, not by a billionaire, but by 3 local journalists who used to work for an outlet called DNA Info, which was shut down. They decided that neighborhoods in Chicago needed hyper-local news and information. So they started Block Club from scratch a little over 5 years ago. And Block Club, I think, is maybe the most successful local news startup in America in the last 5 years. I just really admire what they've done. They've done it because they have feet on the street in neighborhoods in the city providing highly relevant, very local news and information from these neighborhoods, many of which are not getting any coverage from the Tribune or the Sun-Times anymore because those staffs have been cut. So they're filling a need for information in those communities, and they have very reasonable kind of subscription or membership rates. They have a tiered model. I think it starts at like $50 a year. Don't hold me to that because I haven't looked recently. But you know, $5 a month or something like that. And they're also distributing news and information through newsletters. One of the most effective ways now to distribute news and information is good old-fashioned email newsletters. And Block Club, you know, will have story summaries in those newsletters and then take you back to their website. I am a huge fan of Block Club. They're doing it through reader revenue. They're doing it through philanthropy. They're selling merch. Do you remember Chance the Snapper, the alligator who was found in Chicago? They made a lot of money selling Chance the Snapper T-shirts, to people who are interested in that. It was a great idea. They also do it through events, bringing people together around common issues and concerns. That, I think, is a model for what can and should work in local news around the country. And boy, they took a chance. As I say, they were not wealthy. They were journalists, and they have really built something special in Chicago. There are other local news outlets in Chicago that I think are building something that's really interesting. I mentioned Cicero Independiente, covering Cicero and the near west suburbs and a largely Hispanic community. They're off to a great start. There's an organization called The Tribe in Chicago, which is covering young African-American professionals in the city, folks who were not getting news and information geared toward them previously. They're doing, I think, very well. So we are seeing some of these digital startups begin to take hold. And we're also seeing, we also have in Chicago, chains of digital outlets that are coming to the city. I don't know, does anybody subscribe to Axios Local or Axios Chicago? Okay, so that's a newsletter. I think they have 3 reporters that are producing news and information. It arrives in your inbox in the morning, and it's kind of if you're looking for a brief kind of overview of the big stories in Chicago, Axios Local is providing that. Axios is a national news organization. They now have about 30 local newsletters, and it's entirely newsletter driven. Because, as I say, newsletters are a great way to target audience these days. And then there also are outlets like Chalkbeat, which is covering education. They have bureaus. There's an organization called Inside Climate News, which is providing coverage about climate change and the environment in local communities. There are local sports sites, franchises that are networks that are serving local communities. So we are seeing some of these new models beginning to emerge, and I think it's healthy. It's a long answer to your question. I get excited talking about Block Club.
All right, I'll ask a couple more questions. Maybe not a couple, but I'll ask one more question from the YouTube chat, and if anybody else in the audience wants to come up, please do. In terms of vetting information and providing reliable, trustworthy news, can you comment on the ways journalists rely on academic experts and the importance of translating research to the general public? How, if at all, is that relationship changing given general public distrust of both experts and the media?
Yes, so journalists rely on experts and researchers for data and information. When I was a reporter, regularly talked to experts. One of the things that we're seeing in society these days writ large is distrust in institutions. Whether it's distrust in government, whether it's distrust in universities, whether it's distrust in civic organizations around the country. And that's leading to skepticism about experts. All I can say is I think that especially at the university level and at institutions like Northwestern, we kind of go out of our way and spend a lot of time trying to get accurate research and data out to the public. The reputation of the university is at stake in our doing that accurately and reliably. But it kind of gets back to news literacy, knowing where that information is coming from, understanding the source of the information and where that data is coming from is so critical. And I guess I would just encourage folks to read, not skeptically, but carefully in news stories to see where those sources are coming from.
All right, we'll make this the last question. You talked about the threat of generative AI to the already strained business model for local news. You mentioned that the blue-starred beacons of hope benefit from reader and philanthropic support and describe those as a runway to figure out new business models. Do you see state agency ad spending or tax credits as scalable, enough to sustain local news, or are there other promising business models?
Yeah, the advertising set-asides, which exist in New York, which are being considered in some other states, The thing I think that's great about that is that's money the state or the city is going to spend anyway on advertising or marketing, and it's directing it to local publications instead of tech platforms. That's injected, and again, don't hold me to this because I haven't seen numbers too recently, but about $25 million in New York City back to local and community news organizations. And if you're a small news outlet in New York or Chicago, even 50 or 100,000 a year that would come to you in ad revenue, that's a lot of money. And that's money that would allow you to hire a part-time journalist or a freelance writer who could help cover a local community. And the tax credits, I think also, especially for hiring and retaining journalists, are a way to help keep journalists active in communities. And the thing that I like about the tax credit solution is that it's not the government picking winners and losers. It's consumer choice. For example, if you decide to subscribe to a local news organization, then maybe you get a tax credit for subscribing or becoming a member of that news outlet. If you're a business and you decide to advertise in a local publication, it's the business making the choice, it's not the government making the choice. And I think providing incentives for local news outlets to hire journalists is also a way to help stimulate activity. There is no one solution to this local news crisis. It's not just public policy. It's not just philanthropy. It's going to be innovation and entrepreneurship by local organizations that figure out this new digital world that we're all in. It's going to be reader revenue. Yes, advertising can still play a role, but it's going to be not a one, but all of the above type strategy. I think to build a revenue base to support local news outlets across the country, and I hope we get there soon. She asked about AI. AI, by all of the experts that I've talked to, is going to be the biggest revolution since the internet was created 25, 30 years ago. It is going to change all of our lives, and it's going to do it in some pretty profound ways. So, in the news media industry right now needs to be thinking about how it's going to continue to operate in this new AI world. There's some people even predicting that AI could basically end the open web. That right now you go to a website to get local news and information. In an AI world, you just ask an AI assistant, for the story on the Cubs game yesterday, and it'll pop up that story on the Cubs game. You don't have to go to the Sun-Times site or the Tribune site or ESPN to get that information. It just shows up. So then, to posit that theory, why do you need a homepage? Why do you need a website when it's an ask and answer proposition on the web? This could really fundamentally change how we interact with the internet, and it's going to be critical, I think, for news outlets, and I've been espousing this, to get ahead of this train and to get ahead of it now, because how news gets paid for, how it gets distributed, could be very dramatically different in the next 2, 3, 4 years, or maybe even sooner. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your talk, Tim, and answering our questions. I will now read announcements of upcoming society events that will be shared on screen. Let's see if we can find this. Following the program today, our Creative Writers Group will meet in the library upstairs. The group's purpose is to encourage and support aspiring or experienced writers in the community and beyond, and cultivate our written expressions of the human experience. Led by Charlie Sachs, we will meet in person monthly and attend various literary events and keep in touch virtually. Join us and indulge in the delight of creativity and discovery. Our next virtual community chat will be on Wednesday, May 29th at 7 p.m. We share friendship, issues of the day, and fun in a caring Zoom chat. Join us to connect and enjoy each other's company. There will be no Sunday morning program on May 26th in observance of Memorial Day weekend. Our annual membership meeting will be on Sunday, June 2nd at 10:30 a.m. EHS members at any level are encouraged to attend, although only sustaining members will be able to vote. During the meeting, we'll elect 3 trustees, approve the budget for the next fiscal year, and hear reports from our committees. Members should receive an email soon with more details and links. For more details on upcoming Sunday morning programs and other activities, see our website at ethicalhumanistsociety.org, connect with us on Facebook and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for videos of past speakers and future streaming programs. Now, I am going to end today's session with a quote, and I'm going to, in the interest of full disclosure, I asked Gemini to give me a quote that ties together journalism and humanism, and I haven't vetted the source. It gave me a source, so I didn't double check it. Maybe Tim can keep me honest, but here's the quote. At its best, journalism serves as a powerful force for human betterment. It exposes wrongdoing, holds the powerful accountable, and gives voice to the voiceless. It informs citizens and empowers them to participate in a democracy. The journalism that lives up to these ideals embodies a fundamental belief in the dignity and worth of every person. And that is from Bill Kovac and Tom Rosenstiel from their book, Blur, How the News Became Noise. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks again, Tim, for your talk.